Vikram Malhotra didn't do love. He did power. So when his father forced him to marry Milly Wanjiku, a Kenyan woman he deemed unfit for his high society world, he made one thing clear. She would be his wife in name only. He called her a fat burden and a political necessity, never once looking her in the eye. For 6 months, Milly lived in the shadows of his mansion, a ghost in vibrant African silk, adjusting her glasses while Vikram built his empire. But Vikram made a fatal mistake. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. He didn't know that while he was busy fighting wars with bullets, his ignored bride was winning them with algorithms. When a global syndicate locks Vikram out of his own servers and leaves him staring at a screen of death, he's ready to burn the world down. He never expected that the woman he treated like a nobody would be the only one with the key to his survival. Today, we bring you the story of a man who ignored his bride until he realized she was a genius. In the high-stakes corridors of the Malhotra Empire, decisions were never made with the heart. They were calculated with the cold precision of a ledger. For Vikram Malhotra, the heir to a sprawling Mumbai syndicate that operated in the gray space between legitimate infrastructure and the underworld, the latest acquisition wasn't a shipping company or a rival's territory. It was a woman. The Cobalt contract was a masterstroke of geopolitical maneuvering. To maintain his dominance in the global battery market, Vikram needed direct, unfettered access to the rich mineral veins of the Congo, and the gatekeeper to those routes was a Kenyan industrialist named Milly Wanjiku. The price for a lifetime of supply? A blood alliance. A marriage that would fuse the Malhotra steel with Wanjiku's earth. Vikram stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror in his penthouse, adjusting the gold links on his cuffs. He looked every bit the modern predator, sharp, expensive, and utterly devoid of warmth. His father, the aging patriarch who still smelled of old tobacco and gunpowder, stood by the window. The Wanjiku girl arrives tomorrow. His father grunted, not looking back. She's the only child. Secure her, and you secure the next 50 years of this family's relevance. I've seen the dossiers, Vikram replied, his voice a low, melodic rasp. He didn't hide the disdain in his tone. She's unconventional. Not the kind of woman who belongs at a Malhotra gala. She belongs where I put her, his father snapped. You aren't marrying a face, Vikram. You're marrying a continent. The wedding was held 3 days later in a private, heavily guarded estate on the outskirts of Nairobi. It was a somber affair, devoid of the typical Bollywood spectacle Vikram's social circle expected. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the salt of the Indian Ocean, but the atmosphere inside the chapel was as cold as a boardroom. Vikram stood at the altar, his dark sunglasses still perched on the bridge of his nose, a silent statement of his detachment. He didn't turn when the doors opened. He didn't care for the theatrics of the big reveal. He simply stared at the priest, waiting for the transaction to be finalized. When Milly Wanjiku finally reached his side, the silence in the room shifted. It wasn't the silence of awe, but the hushed, judgmental stillness of the Malhotra lieutenants standing in the back rows. Milly didn't fit their mold. She was a woman of substance in every sense, clothed in a vibrant, structured gown of emerald and ochre that seemed to vibrate against the sterile white of the chapel. Her head wrap was a crown of intricate folds, and behind her thick, gold-rimmed glasses, her eyes were calm, uncomfortably calm. Vikram finally cast a sidelong glance at her. He took in her curves, the fullness of her face, and the way she held a leather-bound notebook against her side, as if it were more precious than her bridal bouquet. To him, she looked like a provincial girl playing dress-up in her father's wealth. He saw a fat bride, who would be a social liability, a woman he would have to hide in the back rooms of his life, while he conducted the real business of the world. As they exchanged rings, Vikram's hand was like ice. He didn't look at her face as he slid the diamond onto her finger. He looked through her, as if she were a ghost. You realize, he whispered, so low only she could hear, that this is a signature on a paper, Milly. Nothing more. Don't expect a fairy tale in Mumbai. You are here for the cobalt, and I am here because I have no choice. He expected a flinch. He expected a tear or a stuttering defense. Instead, Milly Wanjiku adjusted her glasses with her free hand, her touch precise and deliberate. She turned her head slightly, her gaze locking onto his with a terrifying level of clarity. "I am not here for a fairy tale, Mr. Malhotra," she said, her voice steady and surprisingly melodic. "I am here because my father believes you are a lion. But looking at you now, I see you've mistaken arrogance for armor. I hope your cobalt is worth the silence you're buying." Vikram stiffened, his jaw tightening under his trimmed beard. He turned back to the priest, dismissing her words as a desperate attempt at relevance. He didn't see the way she looked at the security details tablet on the way out, her mind already decoding their encryption patterns before the "I do's" had even finished echoing. He had bought a wife, but he had no idea he had just invited a Trojan horse into his empire. The humidity of Mumbai hit Milly like a physical weight the moment she stepped off the private Gulf Stream. It was a stark contrast to the crisp, highland air of Nairobi, yet she didn't let the stifling heat crack her composure. She walked down the tarmac with a measured grace, her vibrant Kent-patterned wrap catching the harsh Indian sun, while a phalanx of silent, suited men surrounded her like a funeral procession. Vikram was already in the back of a blacked-out SUV, his face buried in a glowing tablet, not once looking up to acknowledge her arrival in his kingdom. The Malhotra estate was less of a home and more of a fortress. A monolith of cold marble, smoked glass, and state-of-the-art surveillance nestled in the elite heights of Pali Hill. As the iron gates hissed shut behind them, Milly felt the true weight of the golden cage. This was a world of monochromatic shadows, where every surface was polished to a mirror sheen, and every servant moved with the hushed terror of those who served a god of war. Inside the grand foyer, under a chandelier that looked like a cluster of falling diamonds, Vikram finally stopped. He turned to face her, his sunglasses tucked into his breast pocket, his dark eyes scanning her with the clinical detachment of an appraiser looking at a defective product. "This is the East Wing," Vikram said, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "It has been prepared for you. It contains everything a woman of your requirements might need. You will find that my staff is efficient. You are to remain there for the duration of the next few months." Milly adjusted her glasses, her eyes sweeping over the security sensors embedded in the crown molding. "Am I a guest, Vikram, or a prisoner?" Vikram took a step closer, his presence looming over her, a scent of expensive oud and cold steel radiating from him. He gestured dismissively toward her dress, the brilliant greens and oranges that looked like a defiant flame in his sterile, gray hall. "In this house, you are a ghost. Look at you, Milly. You look like a neon sign in a world that thrives on shadows. That costume might have commanded respect in a village, but here, it is a loud reminder of a deal I was forced to make. You are an eyesore to my brand and a distraction to my men." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silky whisper. "Stay out of my sight. Don't attend my galas. Don't wander into the West Wing where I conduct my business. And for God's sake, find something muted to wear. I have enough problems without a colorful bride, reminding the world that I am beholden to your father's mines." He didn't wait for a rebuttal. He turned on his heel, barked an order to his head of security in rapid-fire Hindi, and vanished into the depths of the mansion. Milly stood alone in the center of the vast hall, the silence rushing back in to fill the space he had left. A young maid approached her, head bowed, gesturing toward the shadowed hallway of the East Wing. Milly didn't look insulted. She looked thoughtful. She reached into the hidden pocket of her traditional dress and felt the cool, familiar edge of her ultra-slim tablet. She allowed the maid to lead her to her cage, a suite of rooms filled with silk tapestries and gold-leafed furniture that felt like a museum exhibit. As the heavy oak doors clicked shut, Milly didn't cry. She didn't throw a tantrum. Instead, she walked to the window, watching the digital pulse of Mumbai's skyline. She sat at the mahogany desk, opened her tablet, and began to run a diagnostic on the mansion's local area network. Vikram wanted a ghost. He wanted a silent, invisible bride who would fade into the wallpaper while he played his games of power. He had given her the greatest gift a strategist could ask for. He had made her invisible. And as her fingers danced across the screen, bypassing the first layer of the Malhotra firewall with a few rhythmic taps, a small, sharp smile played on her lips. Vikram Malhotra thought he had locked her in a cage, but he had actually given her a front-row seat to his destruction, and the only hands capable of stopping it. The library of the Malhotra estate was a cavernous, two-story vault of dark mahogany and leather-bound prestige. It was a room designed to impress visitors, yet it was the only part of the mansion Vikram never entered. For him, books were relics of a slower age. For Milly, they were the architecture of the universe. In the weeks that followed her arrival, this sanctuary became her command center. She spent her mornings perched on a velvet ladder or tucked into a deep wingback chair near the bay windows, draped in a soft, kaftan-style gown of indigo silk. To the household staff, she was a curious fixture, a heavy ornament that moved only to reach for another heavy volume. They passed her with superficial bows, their whispers trailing behind them like toxic smoke in the hallways. "Look at her," one of the junior maids giggled in Hindi, assuming the Kenyan bride was as linguistically deaf as she was socially invisible. "Another plate of samosas, and she'll need a wider chair. Does she think reading those dusty books will make the boss look at her? She's a mountain of a woman trying to hide in a forest of paper." Milly didn't flinch. She didn't even look up from the dense equations of quantum field theory she was currently dissecting. Her mind was a high-speed processor, and the insults of the staff were merely low-frequency noise she had long ago learned to filter out. She wasn't just reading. She was mapping the underlying logic of complex systems. To her, the way a subatomic particle behaved was not unlike the way a global financial market fluctuated, or the way a criminal empire secured its digital borders. Occasionally, the head of security, a stern man named Arjun, would walk through the library on his rounds. He would see her with a notebook open, her gold-rimmed glasses sliding down her nose as she scribbled what looked like abstract art. To Arjun, it was gibberish, the idle doodling of a lonely wife. He didn't see the recursive algorithms she was developing to stress-test the mansion's biometric locks. He didn't realize that while he was checking the physical gates, she was already inside the brain of the house, watching the data packets flow through the air around them. The isolation was her greatest asset. In the silence of the library, she observed the rhythm of the Malhotra empire. She learned that Vikram's discipline was actually a rigid adherence to outdated protocols. She saw the cracks in his armor, the way his shipments were timed, the slight delay in his encrypted communications, and the growing pattern of ghost pings hitting his server from a source in Eastern Europe. One afternoon, as a waiter set a tray of tea beside her, he let out a heavy sigh of feigned exertion, making a show of how difficult it was to serve someone of her stature. Milly finally looked up. Her eyes were sharp, vibrating with an intelligence that was almost predatory. "The tea is 3 degrees too cool for an oolong, Ravi," she said in perfect, accented Hindi. "And the trajectory of your sigh suggests a lung capacity that you should really have checked by a doctor. It would be a shame if you collapsed before you finished gossiping about my weight in the kitchen." The waiter froze, his face draining of color. Milly didn't wait for an apology. She simply turned back to her book, her pen flying across the page as she solved a theorem that would have baffled a MIT professor. She was the silent observer, the underestimated genius in a house of wolves. Vikram thought he had exiled her to a library to keep her out of his way. He had no idea he had given her the high ground, and from her seat among the books, she could see the storm coming long before he ever felt the first drop of rain. The digital heart of the Malhotra Empire was supposed to be an impenetrable fortress, a labyrinth of shifting codes and multi-layered firewalls that guarded billions in offshore accounts. But in the quiet hours of a Tuesday morning, a ghost entered the machine. It didn't crash the gates or trigger the sirens. It simply whispered. Vikram sat in his obsidian and glass war room, the glow of a dozen monitors reflecting in his dark sunglasses. Across from him, Khanna, his head of finance, was sweating, a rare and unsettling sight in a room kept at a precise 68 degrees. "It's a rounding error, Vikram," Khanna stammered, pointing to a ledger on the central screen. "A fraction of a percent. We're talking about $50,000 across 3 different Zurich accounts. It's likely a lag in the currency conversion software." Vikram didn't look up from his own encrypted tablet. He flicked a finger, dismissing the notification. 50,000 is the price of a watch, Kana. Don't waste my time with glitches. We are moving 600 million in cobalt futures by Friday. Focus on the liquidity for the Congo transport. But it's happened 3 times this week. Kana persisted, his voice trembling. The money vanishes, then the logs for those seconds are wiped clean. It's like a digital phantom is nipping at our heels. Vikram let out a short, dry laugh. A sound like glass grinding on stone. Phantoms don't exist in my world. Only competitors and cowards. If someone were stealing from me, they'd take millions, not pocket change. Your ghost is a bug. Fix the software and get out. Vikram's arrogance was a towering wall, one he had built over a decade of crushing rivals. He believed in the tangible, the weight of a gold bar, the kick of a handgun, the physical presence of a subordinate. To him, the digital world was merely a tool, and he was convinced his tools were the best money could buy. He couldn't imagine a predator that didn't bleed or a thief who didn't leave footprints. 2 floors away, in the dim, paper-scented silence of the library, Milly Wanjiku sat with her tablet tilted away from the overhead security cameras. She wasn't looking at the ledgers Vikram saw. She was looking at the noise between the lines of code. To her eyes, the $50,000 wasn't a theft, it was a ping. A sophisticated entity was testing the elasticity of the Malhotra firewall, feeling for the soft spots where the encryption lagged. It was the digital equivalent of a burglar checking every window in a mansion to see which one rattled in its frame. She watched a tiny packet of data, no larger than a single character, bypass the main server and nestle into the payroll software. It was a logic bomb, a sleeper cell waiting for a signal. Milly leaned back, her traditional head wrap casting a long, regal shadow against the rows of ancient books. She could see exactly what was happening. Someone wasn't just stealing Vikram's money, they were mapping his nervous system. They were preparing to paralyze him. She thought about walking to the West Wing. She thought about standing before Vikram and explaining that his rounding error was actually the vanguard of a global syndicate strike. But she remembered the way he had looked at her traditional dress, the way he had called her a neon sign and a distraction. Vikram Malhotra wanted a ghost for a wife. He wanted a woman who didn't speak, didn't think, and didn't interfere. Milly adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. If he wanted a ghost, she would give him one. She wouldn't stop the attack. Not yet. She would let the digital ghost tear down the walls of his arrogance brick by brick. Only when he was standing in the ruins of his empire, realizing that his bullets and his bluster were useless against a line of code, would she show him what a distraction could really do. She tapped a single key, masking her own IP address as she began to trace the hackers from the Singapore server back to their origin. Vikram was the lion, but he was blind. Milly was the strategist, and she was the only one who could see the invisible hand reaching for his throat. It was dubbed Black Monday by the few survivors of the Malhotra inner circle who lived to tell the tale. For Vikram, it began not with a bang, but with a terrifying, absolute silence. He was in the middle of a high-stakes video conference with the Congolese ministers, the final signatures for the cobalt trade routes hovering just seconds away from digital execution. Suddenly, the high-definition screen didn't just flicker. It dissolved into a sea of static before turning a deep, bruised purple. Kana. The connection. Vikram barked, slamming his hand onto the mahogany desk. But Kana wasn't answering. The head of finance was staring at his own workstation, his face the color of ash. Across the war room, every monitor began to cascade with a frantic scroll of crimson text. It wasn't a virus, it was a digital autopsy. In real time, the Malhotra wealth was being dissected. The $600 million earmarked for the cobalt deal didn't just vanish. The accounts themselves ceased to exist, their routing numbers rewritten into oblivion. Then, the lights died. The estate, a marvel of modern automation, suddenly became a tomb. The heavy, reinforced steel shutters of the war room hissed shut, triggered by a phantom security breach. The air conditioning cut out, leaving the room to bake in the rising Mumbai heat. Most terrifyingly, the smart locks on every door engaged. Vikram Malhotra, the man who held the city in his grip, was now a prisoner in his own ivory tower. "Sir, the satellite uplinks are down." Arjun, the head of security, shouted over the rising din of emergency sirens that were now wailing from the walls. Our phones are bricks. We're isolated. Someone has geofenced the entire estate and wiped our server core. Vikram pulled his gold-plated handgun, a useless gesture against an invisible assassin. Find a way out. Manual overrides now. But the manual overrides were slave to the central processor, and the processor was currently being eaten alive by the digital ghost Milly had seen weeks ago. Outside, the sprawling Mumbai skyline continued to glow, but inside the Malhotra fortress, the world was ending. The prestige, the authority, and the years of calculated violence were being erased by lines of code that didn't care about Vikram's reputation. 2 floors below, in the shadowed library, the emergency red lights cast long, flickering shadows over the bookshelves. Milly Wanjiku sat perfectly still, the only person in the mansion not screaming. While the security teams threw their shoulders against unyielding titanium-reinforced doors and the tech experts wept over fried motherboards, Milly adjusted her glasses. Her tablet was the only device in the house still functioning, connected to a localized mesh network she had surreptitiously built into the library's ancient wiring weeks prior. She watched the digital ghost finish its meal. The syndicate behind the attack was efficient. They were currently rerouting the Malhotra fleet in the Indian Ocean to a pirate-controlled port. In 10 minutes, the family legacy would be a memory. She heard Vikram's voice from the vents above, raw and cracking with a desperation she had never heard before. He was no longer the lion. He was a trapped animal, realizing too late that his claws were useless against a shadow. Milly didn't move to help him yet. She watched a final line of code execute, a message from the hackers flashing on her screen. Malhotra is offline. Not yet, Milly whispered to the empty room, her voice calm and melodic in the darkness. She tapped a command on her tablet, opening a small, hidden back door she had carved into the mansion's mainframe. She wasn't saving Vikram's money, not yet. She was watching him break. She wanted him to feel the weight of the silence he had imposed on her. She wanted him to understand that the neon sign he had mocked was the only light left in his world. As the mansion's backup generators groaned and failed, plunging the house into a final, suffocating blackness, Milly Wanjiku finally stood up. The ghost was ready to speak. The air in the hallway was thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy, humid heat of a Mumbai afternoon without ventilation. Vikram moved like a shadow, his tailored suit jacket discarded, his white shirt damp with sweat. He had managed to force the manual release on the war room doors, his knuckles bloodied from the effort. In the chaos of the blackout, his men were scattered, uselessly shouting into dead radios. Vikram had one goal, his private office. Beneath the floorboards was a hardwired, analog emergency line, his last hope to contact the outside world. He kicked the double doors of his office open, his handgun raised, expecting to find a physical assassin or a team of looters. Instead, he stopped dead. The room was bathed in a ghostly blue light. Sitting in his high-backed leather chair, the seat of his power, was Milly Wanjiku. She had discarded her vibrant head wrap, her short, natural hair framed by the glow of 3 portable, high-resolution tablets propped up on his mahogany desk. A tangle of sleek, black cables snaked from her devices directly into the mansion's primary data port. "What the hell are you doing?" Vikram's voice was a jagged blade. He surged forward, the barrel of the gun trembling slightly as he pointed it at her. "You're the one. My father said your family was powerful, but I didn't think you'd be the one to gut me from the inside. How much did they pay you to burn my legacy?" Milly didn't even flinch at the sight of the weapon. She didn't look up from the screen, where strings of green and white code were flying past at a speed Vikram's own tech team couldn't track. Her fingers moved across the glass with a rhythmic, percussive grace. "Put the toy away, Vikram," she said, her voice like cool water in the sweltering room. "If I wanted to steal from you, I would have done it from the library weeks ago while you were busy insulting my dress. I certainly wouldn't be sitting in your uncomfortable chair while a Singaporean syndicate tries to overwrite your biometric identity. Get out of my seat." Vikram roared, reaching for her arm to fling her aside. "Look at the screen, you fool." Milly snapped, finally turning her head. Her eyes, magnified by her glasses, were fierce and commanding. For the first time, Vikram didn't see a fat bride or a political burden. He saw a general in the middle of a slaughter. Vikram froze, his gaze dropping to the largest tablet. He expected to see his bank balances hitting zero. Instead, he saw a complex, 3D map of a server farm in Singapore. Small, red nodes were being blinked out of existence one by a surging wave of indigo light. They didn't just take your money, Vikram, Milly explained, her hands returning to the screen. They injected a polymorphic worm into your core. It's not just stealing your assets. It's mimicking your digital signature to frame you for the collapse of the cobalt market. By tomorrow morning, you wouldn't just be poor. The international court would have a warrant for your arrest. Vikram's heart hammered against his ribs. And what are you doing? I'm counter-snaring them, she said, a small, cold smile touching her lips. I've isolated your primary wealth in a dead-drop server they can't see. Now, I'm following their handshake back to the source. Your tech team was trying to build a wall, Vikram. I'm building a guillotine. Vikram slowly lowered the gun, the weight of his own ignorance crashing down on him. He looked at the woman he had relegated to the shadows, the woman he had mocked for her weight and her silence. She wasn't stealing his empire. She was the only thing keeping it from being erased. Why? He whispered, his voice cracking. After how I treated you, why save me? Milly didn't look at him. I'm not saving you, Vikram. I'm protecting the Wanjiku interests. My father didn't send me here to be a trophy. He sent me here to ensure this alliance worked. She tapped a final, aggressive sequence into the tablet. Now, stand back and be quiet. I have a syndicate to bankrupt, and your breathing is distracting me. Vikram stood in the shadows of his own office, a ghost in the empire he had spent a decade building with blood and iron. He watched the blue light of the tablets reflect off Milly's glasses, casting sharp, angular shadows across her face. For months, he had treated her as a secondary character in his life, a silent, colorful backdrop to his own brilliance. Now, as the cooling fans of her devices hummed in the sweltering silence, he realized he was the one who was out of his depth. They didn't break in through your firewall, Vikram, Milly said, her voice steady and devoid of the fear he had expected. She didn't look up. Her eyes were tracking a cascading waterfall of data. They walked through the front door because you left it wide open. You're using a 256-bit AES encryption that was patched 3 years ago. To a specialist, that's not a lock. It's a polite suggestion. Vikram opened his mouth to defend his security team, the best money in Mumbai could buy, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the blood on his knuckles and felt a sudden, sharp pang of embarrassment. Your enemy isn't just a hacker, she continued, her fingers dancing with surgical precision. It's a collective. They've been low and slow harvesting your metadata for 6 months. Every phone call you made, every transaction you authorized, they used to build a behavioral profile. They knew exactly when you would be most vulnerable, the moment the cobalt contracts were ready for signature. They didn't just want your money, they wanted to replace you. They've already generated a deepfake of your biometric ID. If I hadn't intercepted the handshake, the Singapore exchange would have recognized them as the owner of Malhotra International by sunset. Vikram leaned against the edge of his desk, the weight of his own arrogance pressing down on his chest. He had spent his life judging people by the cut of their suit, the strength of their grip, and the sharpness of their silhouette. He had dismissed Milly because she didn't fit his aesthetic of power. He had seen fat and foreign where he should have seen formidable. I had the best engineers, Vikram whispered, his voice sounding small in the vast room. You had yes men, Vikram, Milly countered, finally pausing to look at him. The intensity in her gaze was staggering. They told you what you wanted to hear because they were afraid of you. I'm not afraid of you. While you were busy playing the role of the terrifying mafia boss, I was watching the back doors. I saw the pings from the Singapore server 3 weeks ago. I tried to tell you, but you were too busy telling me to stay in the East Wing and change my clothes. Vikram looked down at his shoes, then at the gun he had nearly used on her. The humbling was absolute. He had been a lion roaring at the wind while a viper was at his heels, and the only person who had the antidote was the woman he had treated like an outcast. The strategy is classic social engineering combined with a brute force bypass, she said, turning back to the screens. They're using your own pride as a blind spot. They assumed you'd be too arrogant to ask for help until it was too late. They were right. If I wasn't here, you'd be a fugitive by morning. She tapped a final sequence, and for the first time since the lights went out, a green system restored prompt flickered on the main terminal. Vikram didn't feel the rush of victory. He only felt a profound, echoing sense of shame. He looked at Milly, truly looked at her, and realized that the most dangerous person in the room wasn't the man with the gun. It was the woman with the brain. What do we do now, he asked. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. Milly didn't hesitate. Now we stop playing defense. You wanted to know why I'm here? I'm here to show you how a Wanjiku handles a threat. Sit down, Vikram. Watch and learn. Milly Wanjiku did not move with the frantic energy of a person in a panic. Her movements were deliberate, rhythmic, and terrifyingly efficient. While Vikram's world had been one of physical intimidation, of looking a man in the eye before breaking him, Milly's world was one of invisible architecture. She reached out and pulled a secondary monitor toward her, her glasses reflecting a sudden surge of amber light as she tapped into the Malhotra Group's dormant, high-frequency trading servers. You have a cluster of offshore servers in the Seychelles that your father used for money laundering in the 90s, Milly said, her voice cutting through the hum of the cooling fans. They're slow, but they have a legacy handshake protocol that the modern Singaporean firewalls won't recognize as a threat. They'll see it as a ghost in the system, a relic. By the time they realize I'm using those servers as a bridge, I'll be inside their primary liquidity pool. Vikram watched, mesmerized, as his bride turned his own dusty, forgotten resources into a digital battering ram. On the screens, a map of the global banking network began to glow. Small, golden pulses began to move from Singapore toward a series of encrypted vaults Milly had just manifested out of thin air. They're trying to block the exit, Vikram noted, leaning in, his tactical mind finally grasping the shape of the battlefield. They're shifting the data to a secondary hub in Hong Kong. Let them, Milly whispered. A cold, predatory smile touched her lips, a look Vikram had previously seen only in the mirror. I'm not chasing the data, Vikram. I'm poisoning the well. I've just injected a script into their Hong Kong hub that identifies their entire capital reserve as stolen assets under the International Anti-Money Laundering Protocol. Every time they move $1 to hide it, they're triggering an automatic freeze by the central banks. The speed of the collapse was breathtaking. In the corner of the screen, a digital clock counted down. At the 40-minute mark, the $600 million that had been stolen from Vikram flashed back into his primary account, the numbers turning from a frantic red to a steady, solid green. But Milly wasn't finished. The money is back, Vikram said, a sense of relief washing over him. We can stop now. We have what we need. You have what you need, Milly countered, her fingers accelerating. But they haven't learned their lesson. You don't just survive an attack, Vikram. You ensure the attacker never has the hands to strike again. With 3 sharp keystrokes, she executed a scorched earth command. She didn't just reclaim the Malhotra wealth. She followed the digital breadcrumbs back to the Syndicate's own secret holdings. She began a rapid-fire liquidation of their shell companies, selling off their positions in the market at a loss, triggering a cascade of margin calls that tore through their finances like a wildfire. On the screen, the Syndicate's net worth began to plummet. Tens of millions of dollars evaporated every few seconds. In the high-rise offices in Singapore, men were likely screaming, watching their screens go dark just as Vikram's had, but without a genius in the room to save them. 55 minutes, Milly said, finally leaning back and exhaling. The blue light of the screens faded as she initiated a total system reboot, the mansion's lights flickering back to life as the digital ghost was finally exorcised. The Syndicate is bankrupt. Their assets are frozen, their identities are flagged by Interpol, and their primary server farm just suffered a physical hardware meltdown. They don't exist anymore. The silence that followed was profound. The air conditioning hummed back to life, sending a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the temperature. Vikram looked at the woman sitting in his chair. She looked tired, her glasses slightly askew, but she held herself with the regal poise of a queen who had just ended a war before breakfast. He realized then that he hadn't just married a genius. He had married a force of nature. He had spent his life looking for power in all the wrong places, never realizing that the greatest weapon in his arsenal was currently sitting in his office, adjusting her glasses and asking for a fresh cup of tea. The morning sun rose over Mumbai, casting long, sharp shadows across the marble floors of the Malhotra estate, but the atmosphere inside had fundamentally shifted. The silence was no longer heavy with the threat of a digital siege. It was thick with the weight of a new reality. In the grand boardroom, the remains of Vikram's elite cybersecurity team stood in a ragged line, their faces pale and their eyes fixed on the floor. Vikram sat at the head of the table, his sunglasses off for the first time in weeks, revealing eyes that were no longer cold, but burning with a quiet, focused intensity. To his right sat Milly. She was dressed in a structured, deep maroon suit that complemented her skin, her glasses perched on her nose as she scrolled through a tablet. She didn't look like a distraction anymore. She looked like the architect of their survival. You were paid more in a month than most engineers make in a decade. Vikram's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that made the lead technician flinch. You had the latest hardware. You had my trust. And yet, while a global syndicate was dismantling my life brick by brick, you were staring at your screens like children watching a magic trick. Sir, the polymorphic nature of the worm was, the technician began, his voice trembling. The worm was a standard entry point for anyone who bothered to look at the legacy handshake. Vikram interrupted, his gaze shifting to Milly. He looked at her not with the boredom of a husband in an arranged marriage, but with the profound respect of a man who had seen a goddess at work. The only person in this house who saw the truth was the person I told you to ignore. Vikram stood up, the movement slow and deliberate. Pack your things. You are finished. Not just here, but in any firm that values its security. If you are seen on this property afternoon, my head of security will treat you as the intruders you effectively allowed into my home. As the disgraced team scrambled out of the room, Vikram turned to Arjun, who was standing by the door. Arjun, from this moment forward, the security of this family, both physical and digital, reports to one person. He turned to Milly. The room seemed to shrink until it was just the two of them. The power dynamic that had defined their marriage, the arrogant boss and the ignored bride, had vanished into the ether. I spent my life thinking that power was something you projected through fear and silhouettes, Vikram said, his voice surprisingly soft. I was wrong. Power is the clarity to see what others miss. Milly, I don't want a wife who stays in the East Wing. I want a chief strategist who sits at my right hand. Not as a political necessity, but as the brain of this empire. Milly set her tablet down and looked up at him. She didn't offer a shy smile or a grateful nod. Her expression was calm, challenging, and entirely in control. She had waited for the world to catch up to her, and now that it had, she wasn't about to play the part of the grateful recipient. A chief strategist has total autonomy, Vikram, she stated. I don't just fix your mistakes. I prevent you from making them. That means your business as usual approach ends today. We are going to rebuild this network from the ground up, and we are going to do it my way. Vikram felt a strange, unfamiliar spark in his chest. It wasn't just respect. It was an attraction rooted in the sheer, unadulterated brilliance of the woman before him. He realized that the golden cage had been a myth. He hadn't trapped her. She had been waiting for him to be worthy of her partnership. Your way, Vikram agreed, bowing his head slightly, a gesture of submission that would have shocked his lieutenants. The staff watched in hushed awe as the couple walked out of the boardroom together. The whispers in the kitchen changed instantly. The mountain of a woman was now the queen of the empire, and Vikram Malhotra, the man who answered to no one, was now walking half a step behind his bride, listening intently as she began to outline the future of the Malhotra name. The hunt was over. The new reign had begun. A year later, the Malhotra mansion was no longer a monochrome fortress of secrets. It had become the epicenter of a global technological revolution. The cold, sterile hallways were now accented with vibrant Kenyan art, and the once silent library was the most active room in the house, hummed with the sound of high-capacity servers and brilliant minds. Vikram Malhotra stood on the balcony of the West Wing, watching the sunset over Mumbai, but his attention wasn't on the horizon. It was on the woman standing beside him, reviewing the final schematics for a Pan-African digital infrastructure project. Vikram looked at his wife, and for the first time in his life, he saw clearly. He remembered the man he used to be, the one who thought power was measured by the price of a suit or the caliber of a weapon. He realized now that those things were merely props in a play he no longer needed to act in. True power, he had learned, didn't roar through a megaphone. It whispered in the lines of a perfect algorithm and saw the world through a lens of infinite variables. When he had first seen Milly, he had allowed his own shallow perceptions to build a wall between them. He had seen a fat bride and an eyesore, never realizing that by judging her by her cover, he was only defining the narrow boundaries of his own intellect. He had been a prisoner of his own arrogance, and Milly hadn't just saved his empire, she had liberated his mind. The board is nervous about the expansion into Lagos, Vikram noted, though there was a smirk playing on his lips. They think we're moving too fast. Milly didn't even look up from her tablet, her fingers moving with the same rhythmic grace that had once dismantled a criminal syndicate. The board is looking at last quarter's numbers, Vikram. I'm looking at the next decade's potential. Tell them to stay in their lane, or I'll automate their seats by Monday. Vikram laughed, a genuine, warm sound that would have been unrecognizable to the man he was a year ago. He reached out and touched her shoulder, not with the possessive grip of a boss, but with the quiet reverence of a partner. He had learned the hard way that a person who challenges your mind and forces you to grow is worth more than 1,000 people who only exist to please your eyes. As the lights of Mumbai began to twinkle below, the story of the Malhotra Empire served as a final, echoing lesson. In a world obsessed with the surface, with the aesthetic, and with the immediate, the greatest weapon remains the invisible force of intelligence. Vikram had once thought he was marrying a political necessity. Instead, he had found the only person capable of truly seeing him. The moral of the story is simple yet profound. Never mistake silence for weakness, and never mistake appearance for ability. Intelligence is the ultimate equalizer. It doesn't care about your weight, your background, or the clothes you wear. It only cares about the vision you have the courage to execute. When you judge someone by their exterior, you don't limit them. You only limit the greatness you might have achieved by their side. In the end, Vikram Malhotra didn't just gain a genius bride. He gained a new way of seeing the world, proving that the most beautiful thing a person can wear is a brilliant, uncompromising mind.